Teşekkürler. Değerli katılımcılarımız,
Distinguished participants and Dr. Perry, welcome. As we all know, a month has passed after the earthquake in our country, but the devastation continues. We believe in the power of being together in this very catastrophic time, and Dr. Perry is our guest for the second time to support us in this process, and we would like to thank them. Before we begin, I would like to give you some information. Please, first, do mute yourself. As Dr. Perry underlined, we need to keep ourselves muted so that we can hear the sound better and the interpretation better, so also the recording can be better. Together with that, if you have any problems with interpretation, you see some icons on the below menu of Zoom, and there you see the globe that says interpretation. Please choose the Turkish channel if you'd like to hear the interpretation. So that's all from me. I hope this will be an effective seminar, and Dr. Perry, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I am very pleased to be here. This is, as you heard, the second webinar that we're having together. We have the intention of having several more of these and continuing to work with our colleagues in Turkey to try to be as helpful as we can. We also have a few print materials that we have provided, and some of them are in the process of being translated, and we will share those with people as they become available. So today, what I want to talk about is a little bit about the basics of the stress response systems and how various adaptive responses have been able to emerge. I'm not sure why somebody else is sharing their screen, but I'm going to share my screen. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I'm going to use slides. This is something that some of you are already hopefully familiar with. This is a set of URLs and places where you may be able to get some more information about the topics that I bring up today. And we are going to be putting it, I think we've already started to put some of our translated content on this website. And let me just take 1 second here and go ahead and see if I can, I'm going to mute everybody if that's all right. Let me see how to do this. Okay, mute that person. I've got to mute that person. Could you please, if I don't know why it won't let me mute everybody. I think it might be because I'm not on the main channel. But if people please remember to mute yourselves, it would make it a lot easier for everybody to have high quality audio. So I'm going to go ahead and mute as many of these folks as I see that haven't muted themselves. Maybe that will work. There we go. All right. So I think we're good there. So, oh, there we go. I was looking at the wrong screen. All right. So if you, over time, we're going to populate a page on this website here with a collection of materials, both webinars and print materials that we think may be helpful over time. And, you know, and I think time is a really important factor in this. I'm not going to, this isn't going to be the focus of this presentation, but if those of you who are at the first presentation, you remember me hand drawing something like this. And this is basically from our many years experience working with individuals and small groups and large groups that are impacted by traumatic experiences. And so over the years, we've really had the opportunity to see how really catastrophic events play out over time in a population. And it's a couple of things that we know. One, as I mentioned in our first webinar, is that the people who are most impacted and most directly involved are the individuals who are at greatest risk. And as you move out from that what we call ground zero, there still is risk, you know. So if you're a first responder, you still have risk for having mental health issues, physical health issues. If you are all much further out, if you live in Istanbul and you were not in the earthquake, but you may know people, you may know a friend of a friend, you may have visited places that were destroyed, you may have work that's influenced or impacted by the event, like all of you are spending your evening learning, you know, coming to be on this webinar. And so your lives have been influenced as well. And over time, as you know, those of you in mental health, you know, the issues are related to secondary trauma and compassion fatigue and decision fatigue, and all of these things impact your life in ways that increase risk for social, physical, mental health problems. And one of the things that we've tried to do is, based upon this estimate of risk, we have a tool that we use that looks at the number of individuals that are going to be impacted by an event. And I've done another webinar that we're translating into Turkish that goes into this in a little bit more detail, and I'll make that available to everybody. But really what I want to point out is that even when there's a relatively small traumatic event, let's say there's somebody witnesses a shooting or somebody is impacted directly by a traumatic event, the people in that person's life and the people that are in that third circle of risk, ultimately you get out to the point where there's about 1,000 people who are impacted by the event, and the people that will end up needing mental health services as a result of that event that really only impacted directly a couple of people is about 250. And so if you think about mental health service delivery in the regular way that we do it, in terms of come to my office, come and get whatever treatment I'm going to do for 1 hour a week, you know, whether it's TFCBT or EMDR or somatosensory or whatever the therapeutic approach you use, you will need 12 clinicians to dedicate half of their clinical hours a week to meet that need. And as you all know, I mean, I'm sure it's the same in Turkey as it is everywhere else we work. I don't know any mental health clinician who's got half of their time open to add new work. We're all of us are already working really at capacity. So when there are traumatic events in a community, it adds to the mental health burden and the physical health burden of systems that are already overwhelmed. And we'll talk more over this series about what do you do with that? I mean, it's a big challenge. And it's a particularly big challenge if you're talking about disasters that are on the scope of what happened in Turkey. And this is probably an underestimate of the number of people that were directly impacted by the event. This sounds this looks daunting, and it is. And the reality is, if we think about conventional mental health model of approaching and trying to meet the needs of that many people, you would have to have 90,000 mental health clinicians working 20 hours a week to do that. And I may be wrong, but the total mental health capacity in all of Turkey is nowhere near 90,000 clinicians. So the reality is, and we'll talk a lot more about this during this series, the reality is all of us who have expertise in mental health, all of us who are in the position to be leaders in this field, have to think about doing some of the work that we normally would do in the conventional way differently. We have to think about our role differently. And I'll come back and talk about that. But we're facing the same thing in every community that has either got a mental health capacity issue or any community that is dealing with catastrophic events like the Ukraine, where they're dealing with the catastrophic events of the war there. We just really have a level of need that far outstrips the ability of our systems to deal with. So one of the things that we'll end up talking about, and one of the things that we know, is that the fundamental strategy of successful community engagement and mental health response is to be aware of and understand this phenomenon, sorry, my slides are bouncing all around, to understand that the pattern of stress is something that we have to understand and address, because in many ways, the long-term negative consequences of a catastrophic traumatic event are related to the way that event alters and influences the stress response systems in people. And it can alter the stress response systems in people in ways that tax the physiological, psychological, social, and mental capabilities of an individual to deal with the experience. And it can wear people out. It can increase your risk for physical health problems, increase your risk for mental health problems. And the normal, predictable, adaptive responses to acute threat over time put you at great risk. And this is kind of what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the ways in which we respond, human beings respond in the acute situation, and then what happens when that is prolonged, and the various ways that can manifest and look. And so again, those of you who were not here the last time I gave a presentation, I use a very simple heuristic, a model to try to describe some of the things that are going on in the brain. And it's this upside down triangle. And if you recall, I make it like this because I'm trying to help people appreciate the organization of the brain as a hierarchy, that there's a top part of our brain and then there's the bottom part of our brain. And that systems in the lower part of the brain pretty much mediate and modulate regulatory functions. And as you get up to the top part of the brain, these systems mediate and modulate complex, uniquely human functions. And we also use this heuristic to describe in various ways. And this is kind of a somewhat simplistic illustration of what we're trying to communicate here to teach. And these are in the lower parts of the brain, there are these really important neurotransmitter networks that collectively reach every part of the rest of the brain and influence functioning in all the rest of the brain, that they also influence and directly go out to the body and influence the heart, the lung, the gut. They indirectly, through the neuroendocrine system and the neuroimmune system, also influence the rest of the body. And they're also the source, the site where all of the incoming sensory input from the inside of your body and the outside will go first. And so this core regulatory network, and I've drawn it like in a very simple way. It's more like this, actually. There's more, it really is that there are multiple neurotransmitter networks. There's norepinephrine and dopamine and serotonin and acetylcholine, and it's a much more complex distribution. But for teaching purposes, think of it as a cluster of cell bodies that reach everywhere. And because of this, these are very important in our stress response systems. And I just want to, many of you, I want to emphasize this: stress response systems, plural, multiple. We don't have just one stress response. And this is something that's really important, because the brain and our body has this remarkable adaptability, this remarkable flexibility. And because of that flexibility, our body, basically guided by systems in our brain, will cope with different kinds of challenges in different ways. And this is important because after a major catastrophic traumatic event, one of the major response patterns is not very well understood and is not very well recognized by the traditional healthcare or mental health or educational systems. And that is the dissociative response. And I'll talk about that a lot in a minute. But just remember that there isn't, a lot of people when they learn it, and again, I'm not saying this to be critical in any way of my colleagues or anybody who teaches or talks about trauma. But one of the things that people talk about a lot when they're learning about trauma or the stress response is that they talk about this linear fight or flight response. And if you, depends on whether you've learned it through the polyvagal theory or you've learned it through other perspectives, it tends to be hydraulic, very linear. And it talks a lot about you'll get activated, and then your amygdala will activate cortisol release, and you'll have all, it's all linear, very simplistic. But I can guarantee you that it's much more complex and multidimensional. And the amygdala is involved, and cortisol is part of the package, but it's not universally having the same impact on every person. And so depending upon the nature of the stressor and the history of the individual, you're going to get heterogeneous responses under threat. And so here's the dilemma. Here's the challenge when you're doing group, when you're trying to help teach about the impact of a single catastrophic event. And that is that not every person is going to react the same way. Not every person is going to be inattentive. Not every person is going to shut down. Not every person is going to act depressed. Not every person is going to act angry. And if somebody acts angry on day 1, they may not act angry on day 10. And so not only is there a heterogeneity of response, there is a lability of response. In other words, you can have a lot of different presentations at different times in the process following a traumatic event. And this complicates simple, linear problem-solving approaches. And that's kind of what we're used to doing. We're used to saying, oh, somebody has symptom A, B, and C, and so we'll do intervention X, and that should get better. But that's not the case with complex traumatic experiences, and it's not the case It's not the way our body or our brains or our mind works. So we've tried to figure this out a little bit. And part of what I'm going to be doing now is talking about teaching a little bit about the stress response systems. And again, I apologize if everybody knows all of this, but I'm trying to teach it in a way that will make it easier for you to turn around and teach, because one of the most important things that we have to do, one of the most powerful things that we can do, is not necessarily, meet the mental health needs of 90,000, have 90,000 clinicians doing all of this work. We need to think about, how do we actually not address this column, but how do we address this column? How do we decrease population risk? And one of the most important things about how we decrease population risk is to look at this. How do we take things that are unpredictable and make them more predictable? How do we take things that are extreme? How do we take extreme activation of the stress response and make it more moderate? How do we take things that are prolonged and feel uncontrollable and bring elements of control? And all of these interventions are not necessarily all of the many, many, many things that you can do to help this, to help move from here to here, are not conventional psychotherapy. They involve different kinds of approaches. And so that's what I want us to think about, is how do we create a sense of predictability? How do we decrease the unknown, the sense of unknown, for the adults that have been impacted by this, for the children that have been impacted by this, for the decision makers and policymakers that have been impacted by this? Because the more we make people understand what to expect, the more regulated they will be as a population, and the better they will be in their decision making. So a big part of what you will do, I believe, what you can do, is psychoeducation, is giving people information about what's going on with them. Why am I so exhausted? Why am I having sleep problems? Will it ever end? How do I make it better? And those are things you can do without having to have an individual therapy session with, 4.5 million people, because you can't do it. The mental health community in Turkey cannot meet the mental health needs by using that approach. So you have to think about, how do we teach people about the stress response, what's normal, how you can understand this stuff, how do you feel better? Honestly, you can take about 25% of the dysregulation away from somebody if they understand. We do this all the time. When we take kids that are in the hospital and they are going to have a painful procedure, if we sit down with them and we explain what we're doing and why we're doing it, they can tolerate the pain so much better. They don't melt down. They don't have anticipatory anxiety the same way. They feel, and then we give them a little bit of control and about when do they want the procedure. Do you want to do it in the morning or the afternoon? You give them a little bit of control. You help them understand why you're doing it, and they're no longer overwhelmed by the procedure. But if you just come in and take them and do a painful procedure on them, you don't talk to them, you don't explain it, they don't know why they're going to this place to have a procedure, they get incredibly anxious and overwhelmed, and they get anxious about any kind of subsequent other event where people come in and want to interact with them. So part of the reason I think that one of the reasons we use these somewhat overly simple heuristics is that we then use them to teach other people. And one of the first things that we want to teach people, and this is a really important point, this is it for those of you who are going to be dealing with policymakers and local authorities and parents and teachers who are trying to cope with all of this. One of the things that you're going to find is they literally aren't going to be in a position to think clearly. They're literally not going to hear what you say accurately, because they're shut down. They're overwhelmed themselves. and I'll talk about that in a minute. And I think I did talk about this a little bit, but as I did say, and as is a really core fundamental learning and principle that you probably have learned if you've learned anything about trauma, is that when people start to feel threat, one of the things that happens is as you activate your stress response capabilities, and for those of you that are caring about biology, this would be like the locus coeruleus, and this would be the amygdala. And as you activate these systems, you're recruiting things that in the moment will help you. This will help you in the moment of threat. But you're also shutting down systems that are not perceived to be important in the moment. And so your higher order thinking and cognition starts to get compromised. You can't retrieve what you already know very well. You can't learn new things very well. You can't process what somebody's telling you accurately. And so this is why you have to say things again and again and again in very simple ways, and then you have to give them something to carry away and read after you left, even though it says exactly what you already told them. And so this is the way we talk about that state-dependent functioning, and how what happens is when you get in this state of threat, you shut down your cortex, and we talk a little bit about how your internal state shifts when you are when you go from calm. You have access to your cortex, and you can think in an abstract way, and then you get a little bit busy and you kind of focus on the external world. You're still using your cortex, but you're not really creating anything new. You're not being that abstract, but you're using cortical functioning. But if you start to get really threatened, you don't have a lot of access to your cortex, and literally you start to be much more reactive and emotional in your functioning. And now, ignore this up here, this row up here for a second. So this is how we talk about state-dependent functioning. And then we show in a different version of that as we go, oh, when you're calm and alert and you're not hungry or thirsty or cold, and you have a place to live, and the future looks bright, and you have a good job and stability and security, you can use this smart part of your brain. And that means that when something new comes in, you can learn it. You can efficiently get information from the, as it comes into your brain, and process it and effectively internalize new content. You can equally retrieve previously stored content and use it. And so this is sort of us at our best. When we're regulated, human beings function at their best. They can be most empathic. They can be most thoughtful. They can be most creative. But when we start to get tired, and we get sleep deprived, and we get hungry, and we get thirsty, we literally should start to shut down. And if we've had such a prolonged set of unpredictable extreme stressors, our baseline level of reactivity changes. So our baseline changes. We're no longer have this internal neurobiological organization, so that our internal responses are proportional to the external challenge. Under normal circumstances, you'll have a moderate stressor, and then there'll be an appropriate internal response. Oh, and I wanted to be right here. Sorry. And so you'll be in an active alert state. So if there's a moderate stressor, you'll be in an active alert state, which means you still have access to your cortex. But if you have had prolonged unpredictability and prolonged or extreme, more than moderate stressors, and this is what's going to happen to many, many, many of the individuals who have been impacted by this event, you will have a sensitized stress response system. Now, what part of the stress response system is sensitized will depend upon what part of the stress response system you were using under those circumstances. So keep this in mind, and let me walk you through this a little bit. And again, this is an oversimplified version of this, but this is a good place to start. And then we'll go into more detail and more depth through future webinars and as we do more consulting around this. But you think of this like when you learn to play the piano, you have to learn your scales. Before you can sort of be creative and do jazz music and all kinds of other things, you have to learn how to play the scales. This is learning the scales. So here's the basics. The people that get threatened activate stress response capabilities that by and large shut down the top part of your brain. So that part's not as efficient. That's one of the first scales. All right, let's get a little bit more detailed here. You have in your body and your brain the capacity to activate what you all know of as the fight or flight response. This is kind of what you've all learned as sort of trauma 101. So when you get external threat, it activates, the locus coeruleus and sort of the lower threat-related systems. They start this cascade of activation and interpretation. See, the thing is, as information gets up here, you start to have the ability to process it and go, all right, what's the appropriate response? And then you use some aspects of your cortex to kind of figure out what is the appropriate response here. And if it is something that you can potentially run away from, or you can realistically resist and fight, then you will continue to use the fight or flight response, right? But if you're a baby, babies cannot fight effectively or flee effectively. They cry and they expect somebody to come and fight for them or flee with them or feed them or meet their needs. So when they feel distressed, they're looking to external stress responder, right? Mom, dad, auntie, uncle, whoever's around. So when they get really scared or upset or hungry, they cry. And under normal circumstances, somebody comes and meets that need. But as you get older and you get capable of moving and running and hiding or running and fighting back or resisting, you activate this traditional fight or flight response, which does shut down your cortex over time, but it really powerfully activates certain parts of your brain. Now,
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
Sorry, my watch is speaking to me. I apologize. So think about this for a minute. Now, what I want you to appreciate again back here is if I back up, this is a graded response. It's a graded response. So there are times when you activate your stress response, when these systems get activated, but you haven't shut everything down yet. And then you can get a little bit more activated and you start to get more stirred up. And then you can really start to get more shut down. And so the truth is, I want you to appreciate this is a graded response. It's not like turning on a light bulb. I mean, it's not like turning on a light switch. It's either on or off. That's not the way it works. It's graded. It's gradual. It's more like having one of those light switches where you can kind of change it from being low light, medium light, high light. That's kind of what it is. It's graded. So there's a gradation of this response. You can go from calm to alert to alarm to fearful to literally terrorized. The second thing that's important to know is that this traditional fight or flight thing that everybody learns about as part of Trauma 101 is not the only response pattern. You can actually start to get activation from the external world and activate your stress response system. And as you start to interpret the situation, guess what you realize? I can't get, this is inescapable. I can't get away from this. So I need to change the way I'm functioning. I need to prepare my body for injury. Instead of activating my body to send all my blood out to my muscles and increase my heart rate to 130, 140, I need to sort of physiologically adapt to the fact that I might get injured. And so I need to decrease my heart rate. I need to keep my blood in my trunk. I need to release my body's own opioids. I need to activate my parasympathetic system to basically prepare to survive. I need to shut down. That is a much more adaptive response when you are in a painful, unavoidable, distressing situation where you have no control. So oddly enough, and most people don't think about it this way, human beings in everyday life and young children use dissociation way more than they use the hyperarousal response when they're under threat. We use dissociation all the time, every day. And first of all, I don't want to pathologize dissociation, because here's what happens. And again, we'll talk about this in more detail on another one of the webinars. But when you look at the way the brain works, the brain takes information in from the outside world. It starts to process it here, and then it starts to process it here. And you get to this point that's sort of right in between. That involves the hippocampus, and it's kind of between the cortex and the limbic system. You have something called active working memory. And when active working memory fills up, it can't hold that much stuff. When it gets too full, what happens is you start to dissociate. You disengage. And so people that study cognitive psychology will tell us, here's what we know: you can only stay externally focused, purely externally focused, for a little period of time, and then your active working memory fills up, and then you have to dissociate. And when you dissociate, what that does is you just take less information in from the outside world. And then you process that information up here. You decide, how does that fit my worldview? And then you play with it. And then once you sort of have processed that a little bit, you're able to go back and focus on what's going on in the world. And so the really interesting thing, and this is very, very important clinically, very important for human communication, human beings experience the present not in a continuously I'm with you way. Human beings experience the present in these little bits of I'm here, I'm focused here, I'm here, I'm here. It's a little bit that you all know how movies are made, right? Movies are not continuous. They're not, when you see a movie, it's an illusion of movement. It's just photographs. And there's actually more time between photos than there is captured by the photo. So in reality, if you look at a 1-minute film, you're only capturing really a few seconds of reality. But if you spread them out long enough, it makes us, if you take a photo every 8 seconds in a minute, you actually think you're seeing a continuous minute of reality, and you're not. And that's the way your brain works. Your brain is not really fully present all the time when you're in an interaction, even when you're trying to be fully present. Turns out that this is about 15 seconds. We can be externally fully focused for about 15 seconds before we have to disengage a little bit and process. And then we can focus, and then we can process, and then we can focus, and then we can process. And so that is dissociation. So, somebody unmuted, please mute. Thanks. I'm going to see if I can. Okay, they muted. Good. Okay. All right. Now I can go on and on this, but the point is, I wanted to talk a little bit about dissociation. And then I want to talk about the reality. The reality is that very, very few people do hyperarousal completely or dissociation completely. Most people do some mixture. So when the threat comes in, this is the dissociative response. When the threat comes in, this is kind of the way most people go. You have a little bit of activation, and then you kind of don't know what to do, and you're kind of semi-paralyzed, and then you activate, and then you have some of your system gets activated and some of your system gets shut down, and you go back and forth, and it's a mixed response. Let me just show you what I mean by that. Well, let me do this first. Sorry. So if you are hyperarousal dominant in an event, if you are threatened again and again and again, or you experience things where you use the fight or flight response again and again and again and again, you will develop a sensitized threat response in the systems that mediate the hyperarousal response. So you'll have an arousal dominant sensitization. Now we see a lot of kids like this. These are kids that might grow up in a domestic violence environment or grow up with community violence. They are externalizing in their symptomatology. They're hypervigilant, they have sleep problems, they get labeled ADHD, they have an increased start, all of that physiological reactivity. Their resting heart rate's high, 105, 110. And so when instead of having a proportional response to an external challenge, like a test or a social challenge, they'll have an overreaction. They will literally, even when they're just having a regular daily life challenge, like a transition from one class to another, they'll act as if they're under threat. And so they are much more impulsive, aggressive, inattentive, difficult. They have difficulties with transitions, difficulties with changes in schedule, difficulties with, and again, you guys who do mental health work, you know exactly what I'm talking about. These kids, that's sort of a hallmark of a sensitized stress response system. The other hallmark of a sensitized stress response system that's arousal dominant is that group of kids that has a hard time falling asleep. And then when they do fall asleep, they wake up about 2.5 hours later, and then either crawling with mom and dad, or they wander the house, or they're up multiple times at night. And this is because of the primal role of the locus ceruleus in sleep architecture. And so when the locus ceruleus gets activated as you come out of deep sleep, instead of getting to a sort of a different stage of sleep, you literally wake up, because you have a sensitized stress response. Now, the difference between this hyperarousal response and the dissociative response is that the dissociative response has a completely different set of adaptations. When you dissociate, you disengage from the external world. You retreat to your inner world. You try to be invisible. You try to avoid relational contact. And the behavioral manifestations of dissociation are very different than this. When you have a sensitized stress response or arousal response, you are tuned up. You are, like I said before, you're overactive, you're overly reactive. And over time, instead of having these normal sort of I'm focusing and I'm activated and I'm kind of withdrawn and I'm disengaged, this is the kind of the normal up and down of how much you focus externally, internally. These kids, number one, they're tuned up at baseline. They're reactive. You might be with them as a teacher or an adult and interact, and they seem completely normal. And then they leave your classroom, and as they run into somebody in the hallway, they might have a little trigger, and then they'll act really aggressively. And so this lability of their behavior is, again, a hallmark of a hyperarousal dominant sensitized stress response system. And these kids tend to have high resting heart rates, and they get frequently labeled as ADHD. They have a very hard time learning. They have a hard time sitting still. They do a lot of self-stim, self-regulatory things that drive teachers crazy. Now, if you use dissociation, if you're a dissociation dominant person, this is, and I will tell you that I think that when you are in an earthquake and your home is destroyed and you don't know where you're going to go and the adults around you are stunned, the dominant behavior is going to be dissociation. It's an inescapable, unavoidably painful situation, and unavoidably emotionally painful elicits dissociation as well. They feel helpless. And so they're going to dissociate. And when they dissociate, rather than having this fight or flight set of behaviors, now here's the classic arousal continuum. The first step is to do social referencing and flocking. You kind of look for what's going, help interpret the situation by looking around, and then you feel paralyzed, and then you flee, and then you fight. This is sort of that traditional arousal continuum. But dissociation is a very different continuum. Dissociation involves it. First of all, when you're sitting calmly and quietly at home and you're reflecting, you're in your head, right? You're thinking about things. Dissociation is helping you do that. You're tuning out the background noise from the street. You're tuning out conversations that other people are having, and you're focused on your inner world. And now, if you are using a dissociative coping mechanism in a social situation, you tend to be avoidant. No eye contact. These kids are frequently considered shy, withdrawn, sweet, because they don't cause behaviors that really upset the adult world. So these kids get missed. These are the kids that hurt inside, but because they're not upsetting the adult world, they rarely come to our attention until they get a lot older. And then they can self-present. And then the interesting thing, and this is a very, very powerful and important point, and this, you guys are going to run into this a lot. You are going to interact with people who are dissociative, and they're going to look at you and you're going to say, this is what I think you should do, and blah, 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 and why don't we do this? And they'll kind of look at you and they'll literally give you nonverbal and sometimes verbal affirmation that they understand and they think it's a great idea, and they're going to do exactly what you said. And then you go away. And because they're partially shut down, they're using social mimicking behavior. They don't really process accurately what you said. So they don't follow through with what you said. And you're like, what the hell? I mean, I talked with them, I told them, and they said, yes, I understand. I'm going to do A, B, and C. But what they typically do is A. They hear part of it. Remember, they only have inefficient processing. They have part of their cortex open, right? They have part of it that's open, but they're kind of like daydreamy. They're not really effectively processing everything fully in their cortex. It's kind of slow uptake. They're kind of half there, they're not there. And it leads to lots of misunderstanding, lots of distortion of information. You'll say, like, I told you it was going to be at 2 o'clock. And they'll go, no, you didn't. And you'll go, yes, I did. I told you it was at 2. And you nodded. You said you're going to be there. This is what happens with dissociation. And that leads to lots of misunderstanding. And then misunderstanding leads to more anger and frustration. And that leads to more dissociation. And so you're going to find that your ability to communicate with even the leadership, even the people in charge of things in these situations, is going to be tainted by this dissociative and state-dependent phenomenon around cognition. They're just not going to be processing as efficiently. And you're just going to have to be patient. And you have to repeat things, and you have to write things down. And you're just going to have to expect that sometimes they're going to be here. When they're here, they're going to get it. They're going to be able to hear you. But sometimes they'll be right here. And even if you're in a one-on-one interaction with them, they kind of have this, they look like we use a saying, a deer in the headlights. But I don't know what the saying is, but they kind of look just like they don't know what's going on. And then sometimes they will literally walk around like a zombie. Many of you have probably seen either photos or interacted with people in the midst following an acute traumatic event. And there's sort of this numb, robotic quality to the way a lot of the individuals work. And that's dissociation. It's trying to protect the person from that emotional pain. And you're going to see a lot of that. Now, the other thing you're going to see is a mix. So if you develop a sensitized dissociative or a sensitized arousal response, and you are exposed to a cue, an evocative cue that's associated with the situation that was traumatic for you, you're going to see a change in their behavior and in their functioning. And you all know this is sort of bread and butter PTSD, cue related evocative cues, triggers, that kind of stuff. So you guys know all about this. What's interesting though is that you can have the same thing for dissociation. Certain cues can literally make somebody go from being pretty normal and functioning within the typical range, able to process information, to literally being completely inaccessible. We've had kids that have had full-blown catatonic events. We have kids that have such a sensitized dissociative reaction. When they get exposed to an evocative cue here, they literally go from being normal and interactive to having such a big drop in their heart rate that they faint. So syncope, you're going to hear about kids that faint. You're going to hear about, that's frequently a sensitization response. And then you're going to have a lot of kids that have a mix. So there are kids that certain things will remind them of the evocative, the traumatic experiences where they used hyperarousal again and again and again, and they'll have an externalizing set of behaviors. And then another evocative cue will be from situations where they were in an inescapable, unavoidably painful situation. And many kids that have complex trauma or have multiple traumatic experiences as they grow up, particularly if they had things when they were very young, will have this mixed response. Some things make them blow up, some things make them shut down. And in the United States, for a long time, these kids were interpreted as having rapid cycling bipolar disorder. But it really wasn't bipolar disorder. It was really related to the complex traumatic history, where they had cue-specific reactions that were dramatic in both directions. Now, so I only have a few minutes left to talk, and I know I didn't go into too much detail about the actual specifics. Let me stop this and talk for 1 second about some of the things that I think are you're going to see related to state-dependent functioning. So one of the things that you're going to see is a shift in, and this is true whether you are dissociative or hyperarousal. This is true of both of those patterns, is that your sense of time as you start to feel dysregulated or threatened, it shifts. So when you're talking about things that you want to do in a month to people who are in this state, their brain just doesn't care. Their brain can't even process that accurately. So you have to remember that if you're going to use either rewards or consequences or talk about things that are too far away from the present, it's just going to have no relevance for those people. They will not really focus on anything in the future if some of their fundamental needs aren't met. The other thing that's interesting, and again, another way to sort of conceptualize this is to remember that the brain develops from the bottom up. And when you're threatened, you shut down from the top down. So in a very realistic way, when you have these threat-related or trauma-related responses, there's going to be functionally a regression. So even if you're a fully mature, like 50-year-old mayor of a city, they're going to have some aspects of their behavior that are just going to be like their toddlers, childlike. They're going to be children in the way they function and process. And you'll see it in the way they're punitive and reactive, and their problem solving will be very immature, very concrete. And the key is that you have to try to do what you can to help individuals who are in this state feel more regulated. And we can talk a little bit about that, some of the regulatory strategies that can be helpful in large group and in individual interactions, maybe in the next session or in future sessions. The final thing I want to talk about in terms of state-dependent functioning, and again, we'll come back and talk about a lot of this stuff at different points, but I want you to remember that there's a state dependence that exists not just for people, for individuals, but for groups. And you're going to see this in the ways in which different systems and different groups of people choose to address some of the challenges that go along with this earthquake. So here's the thing that you should know is that whenever any working group, whether it's a family, whether it's a, it could be a family, could be an organization, if that organization has unlimited supplies and resources, and that organization is safe and stable, the people in that organization will be calm. They'll feel safe. They have a job, they have a future. And so when you're in an environment, because of the relational contagion of human beings, if you have an organization where there's all of these elements, the solutions to the problem can be very, very abstract and future oriented. And people feel safe enough to treat other people respectfully and in a nurturing and positive way. Now, I have to say, there aren't a lot of organizations like this. Organizations, by and large, are almost always functioning under some degree of resource limitation, right? There's everybody, even if you have a really well-funded program, a well-funded hospital, a well-funded department, they're always worried about, where's the next grant coming from? How are we going to pay for all of this stuff? So almost all governmental organizations, almost all organizations where there's more than 50 people, begin to have kind of a built-in degree of unpredictability and a built-in inefficiency that's related to permeating anxiety about how do we maintain our organization. And so the climate becomes overly focused on self-preservation and overly focused on self. And what happens is the solutions and the problem solving is very concrete. And if you have a resource poor, overwhelming, threatening situation, and this is actually probably what's going on in some areas of dealing with this current catastrophic earthquake, is that a lot of the problem solving is going to be really, really, really reactionary. And this is something that you should just watch out for. Just be aware of the fact that the people, if you have people that are coming from outside who are philanthropic folks, who are well-funded, who are trying to help, they're going to be in a different mindset than the people that they're trying to help. And so you're going to have a disconnect between, sort of in some cases, people will feel that this is unrealistic. This is impractical. You don't know the situation. So this is where the idea of, hey, let's give every child who doesn't have a place to sleep and is afraid of going inside of buildings and had people in their lives die. Our solution to that will be, instead of giving money so you can buy food and shelter and water, let's give everybody a teddy bear. And I think that that's stupid. It's well-intended, but I don't think that throwing teddy bears at this problem is the way to solve the problem. But you're going to get people, we've seen this happen again and again and again and again. The further you are away from the traumatic event, the more unrealistic are your ideas about what will help the people who have been impacted by this event. The other thing is, and I mentioned this before, is the more uncomfortable people get with the level and intensity of distress and the duration of distress. They want it to get better. They don't want it to stay bad. But I can guarantee you it's going to stay bad for many people for a long time. And this is a very hard thing to face, and it's part of the reality of dealing with a huge catastrophic event like this. So, all right, I'm going to stop. I know that I touched on a lot of different things. I suspect that there may be a couple of questions, but I think I'll stop here. And Madhur, how would you like to, would you like, let me just tell everybody, we haven't really figured out exactly how we're going to get everybody's questions answered. But what we're just so you know, we're going to try to figure that out. We're going to work together to try and come up with ways to get feedback from everybody, and then to come back and have some conversation about some of these topics. So the next webinar will be longer. There'll be a little bit of a presentation, but then there'll be more of an opportunity to have some in-depth conversation about answering questions that came up on this webinar and questions that may come up in related to this event that are afterwards. So, but we're not going to do that today. We're just going to collect these questions, and we're going to sort through them and see if we can have if some frequently asked questions emerge, we can try to address those. Sound good, Madhur?
Çok teşekkür ederiz Doktor Peri.
Thank you very much, Dr. Perry. We also would like to thank all our participants as well for their valuable participation. And while you were presenting, some participants were actually responding to others' questions, as some of them already participated in your webinar. One question was that you said that in the first month, the brains will not really comprehend what will be done. What do you mean there? Do you mean the personal support or the psychotherapy? It's like psychotherapy won't be really understood, right? That's what we understand from that.
Yeah, and again, I'm glad you asked that, because I would just want to clarify that in our experience, if you are in that inner circle where you are most directly impacted by this event, that we found that in the first month, people were so overwhelmed by the intensity of the experience that they could only tolerate tiny little doses of really visiting, if you will, in a therapeutic way, the traumatic experience. Now, that I don't mean to imply that that traditional therapeutic work is not useful or can't be used with folks. But what we found is that, and this is something that we find universally, is that with a traumatic experience or something that's intensely emotional, people can only stay with that intensity for a short period of time, and then they have to back out. And so those of you who have done, traditional psychotherapy, you know what I'm talking about. You'll start a session, and then you might get into something that's really intimate and intense, and that might last for a minute, and then they'll kind of back out. And all of psychotherapeutic writing is about defenses and transference and countertransference. And they're capturing some of what I'm talking about in terms of the therapeutic process. The therapeutic process involves this dipping into intensity and dipping back out, and dipping in and dipping out. And when you're so close to a traumatic event, the ability to dip in is compromised, and the depth to which you can go is, I don't want to say compromised, but it's just so overwhelming that it's probably better to not try to do traditional psychotherapeutic stuff at that point. It's fine to be with somebody. It's fine to talk about regulatory stuff. It's good. Psychoeducation, we found, is really helpful. But even the ability to process what you're trying to teach is compromised because of state-dependent functioning. So we've found that supporting the natural relational resources of a person is much more effective than trying to do traditional psychotherapeutic work. And it's just really, it's about bang for your buck. How do you want to spend your time? If you want to spend a time trying to do psychotherapy, you can do that. But I would say that if you took that hour and you took 10 people in that person's life and taught them a little bit about what to expect, that would be more helpful in the long run. And it's all about timing. It's about when is somebody ready to do that kind of work? And in our experience, in that first month, they're just so overwhelmed that they're not in a position to do too much. And of course, that's when everybody's around. And 6 months later, when they really are overwhelmed and ready to do some of that work, most of the mental health supports are gone. That's kind of what I was trying to say. I hope that makes sense.
Çok teşekkür ederiz.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay. So I hate to do this, but I think I'm going to end this session, and we are going to have opportunities in the next weeks that follow to have more in-depth conversations and answer some questions. So I just want to thank you all for coming. I appreciate, I know it's in the evening for you guys, so thank you very much, and keep up the good work. Take care of yourself, because this is a long process if you're going to, stick with this and try to help everybody.
Çok teşekkür ederiz Doktor Peri. Sağ olun.
Thank you very much, Dr. Perry. See you.
You bet. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.